Some stories start with fireworks. Mine started with silence, the kind that settles over a backyard stripped bare. The ground was torn open. The air smelled of sawdust and diesel, and where my grandfather's shed once stood, there was nothing but mud and tire tracks. The Maple Heights Homeowners Association had finally done it. They bulldozed my shed. It wasn't just any shed. It was a piece of my family. My grandfather built it by hand in the 1950s. Every board was measured by eye, every nail hammered with patience. He used that shed to mend farm tools, store lumber, and hide Christmas gifts when we were kids. It survived storms, renovations, and generations. It had been standing long before Maple Heights even existed. To me, it was heritage. To them, it was a code violation. It began months earlier with a single letter slipped under my door. The HOA claimed the shed violated community aesthetic standards. They wanted it removed or replaced with modern architectural consistency. I ignored it, assuming common sense would prevail. But the next notice came with a fine. Then another. Then they stopped warning and started planning. On a Friday morning, while I was at work, the excavation crew rolled in. No notice, no permission, just a demolition order signed by the HOA president, Harold Burns. When I came home that evening, my backyard looked like a construction site. The shed's frame was gone, crushed into splinters. A part of me wanted to break, to scream, to fight. But another part, the quieter one, was already calculating. See, I knew Harold. He was one of those men who saw leadership as a license. The kind who measured worth in rulebooks. He moved into Maple Heights 2 years ago and turned the HOA into his miniature empire. Fines for untrimmed hedges, citations for cracked driveways, passive-aggressive emails signed, "Best community regards." And he'd set his sights on my grandfather's shed from the start. After that day, I didn't argue. I didn't confront. I just started researching. I went through every HOA document I could find, the covenants, the amendments, the property maps. I stayed up late scrolling through government databases, reading long-forgotten deeds. The more I read, the more something felt off. The HOA always acted like they owned every inch of Maple Heights, like our backyards were merely rented slices of their kingdom. But when I compared their boundaries to county plat maps, something didn't line up. The property lines were wrong, subtly wrong. At first, I thought it was a mistake in the drawings. But then, deep in the county archives, I found something older, something they'd overlooked. A document from 1923, handwritten in fading ink, easement reserved for agricultural storage, running 50 feet beyond primary boundary. Agricultural storage. Tool shed. My grandfather's shed. That shed wasn't encroaching on HOA land. It was sitting on an easement that technically belonged to my family's original property lot, decades before the neighborhood was developed. The HOA didn't just demolish a structure. They'd trespassed on my land. When I realized that, the bitterness turned into something else. A quiet, determined satisfaction. I gathered the evidence, piece by piece. Property plats, deed transfers, surveyor notes. Each one confirmed it. The HOA had bulldozed a building on a plot that hadn't been theirs since the Wilson Land Grant Act created the easement. And under state law, any entity that removes or destroys property on privately owned land owes restitution or forfeiture of equivalent real estate. They'd taken something from me, but they didn't know yet that I was about to take something much bigger from them. That night, I stood where the shed once was, in the soft glow of the security light, staring at the torn-up soil. The ground still glistened with the memory of rain. I thought of my grandfather's calloused hands and how much pride he took in that small wooden space. They thought they'd erased it, but what they'd really done was awaken it. And soon enough, Maple Heights would learn a lesson in property law the hard way. Because by the next board meeting, their prized neighborhood park, the one they bragged was their community gem, was about to legally belong to me. Most people don't think property lines can wage wars, but in Maple Heights, they started one that no one saw coming. After the shed fell, I traded hours of sleep for hours in archives. My house looked less like a home and more like a detective's office. Maps spread across every table, binders stacked beside coffee mugs gone cold, and notes scrawled in the margins like battle plans. Nothing about my grandfather's easement was simple. The legal jargon twisted the truth into knots, and old county maps contradicted newer HOA blueprints. But buried beneath the bureaucracy was something undeniable. A thin, unbroken line in faded ink, cutting right through a section of land the HOA swore was theirs. The Maple Heights Park. The same park where Harold Burns held mandatory community cookouts. The same patch of manicured lawn and playground equidistant from several homes. It was the HOA's prized jewel, its centerpiece. And half of it, legally speaking, wasn't theirs at all. First, I didn't believe it. I triple-checked every record. I compared GPS markers, cross-referenced plot dimensions, even hired a private surveyor to confirm. The result was irrefutable. The 1923 agricultural easement extended 50 feet past what the HOA considered its northern boundary, right under the park's picnic pavilion, mulch beds, and half the basketball court. It was my family's land. That meant the HOA hadn't just bulldozed my shed without authorization. They'd done it on my property. The realization hit like lightning. In a single act of arrogance, they'd broken every rule they lived by. I felt both fury and amusement battling inside me. The same organization that fined people for mismatched lawn edging had illegally seized land for 40 years without once realizing it. I documented everything meticulously. Every deed transfer, every plat, every boundary shift. The old surveyor documents even listed an annotation from my grandfather's time. Family rights intact per original land division. The HOA's lawyers had never noticed because they built the community in phases, overlapping maps without reconciling legal descriptors with historical ones. It was sloppy, and now that sloppiness was going to cost them. Before I made any move, I needed confirmation at the source county land records. I spent an entire morning at the courthouse, waiting while an elderly archivist flipped through massive ledgers that smelled like time itself. At one point, she smiled faintly and said, "You know, you might be the first person to actually read these pages in 50 years. Those pages didn't just confirm the easement, they revealed exactly how far it reached. It ran beyond the park, past the HOA's official maintenance shed, and touched the corner lot they used for storage, effectively slicing their facilities into two ownerships. Half theirs, half mine. By law, I couldn't remove their structures outright, but I could restrict their access and use. In other words, I could reclaim control over their most valuable land. Still, I wasn't ready to tell them. Not yet. I wanted every document filed, stamped, and notarized. I filed a formal ownership clarification with the county deeds office. It was boring, bureaucratic paperwork, but it turned into the trigger that would ignite everything. Word spread faster than I'd expected. Within a week, whispers started. "Did you hear about the guy suing the HOA? They say he owns the park now." Neighbors who used to nod politely at meetings now stopped me in the street. Some with fear, some with admiration. Harold, of course, was livid. His emails began again, demanding meetings, accusing me of fraud, threatening community legal action. But he was no longer the one with leverage. I didn't even reply. The same day his third threat letter arrived, a certified mail envelope landed on his desk from the county assessor's office. Inside was a simple update, acknowledgement of my ownership claim pending validation. The HOA board held an emergency session that night. Lights blazed through their office windows well past midnight as they scrambled through old files trying to prove I was wrong. But there was nothing left to find because I wasn't wrong. Every document, every timestamp, every plat coordinate said the same thing. The HOA had built half their beloved park and their maintenance structures on land they didn't own. The following week, the county clerk confirmed it officially. The easement was still valid. Legally, the land was mine. The Maple Heights board didn't know it yet, but the balance of power had just flipped. The people they once fined for fence colors and lawn size were about to watch a single homeowner hold authority over the association's crown jewel. I didn't celebrate that night. I just stood where the shed once stood, holding the signed property confirmation in my hands. It was quiet again, but not the same silence as before. This one felt heavier, poised. Harold had taken my family's history. Now I was about to take his kingdom. By the time the next HOA board meeting rolled around, Maple Heights buzzed like a pot ready to boil over. Rumors traveled faster than facts, and I could feel dozens of eyes following me whenever I walked down the street. Every whisper carried the same question. Is it true? Did he really take the park? The tension was thick enough to taste. The board called for the meeting in the community center, the same one my grandfather's easement technically ran beneath now. Rows of chairs filled up quickly. Residents came armed with curiosity, fear, and quiet satisfaction. They'd all suffered under the board at some point. Now something was shifting. At the front sat Harold Burns, red-faced, gripping a binder like it was armor. Behind him, the other board members fidgeted nervously, scanning the stack of papers he'd brought, his failed counter-evidence. He called the meeting to order with his usual pomp, banging the gavel twice harder than needed. He rambled about deceitful rumors and illegitimate claims, but his voice carried a tremor. For the first time since I'd lived there, the authority in his tone sounded forced. Then, right before he could bury the discussion in procedural nonsense, I stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. Everyone was already listening. I held up a small folder, thin but heavy with power, and walked toward the front of the room. This was the same folder I'd spent weeks building. Inside was every piece of proof that mattered. County maps, historical documents, notarized confirmations, and photographs from the courthouse archives with signatures that belonged to men who died decades before any HOA existed. I placed it gently on the table before him. What followed felt like something out of a courtroom more than a neighborhood gathering. I explained how the land under the park had once been part of a large homestead owned by my family. How an easement created in 1923 preserved rights for agricultural storage and access that were passed down through deed inheritance. How no subsequent development had ever legally dissolved it, meaning the HOA had unknowingly built half their park and maintenance structures over private land for 40 years. The murmurs in the crowd rose and fell in waves. Some gasped, others whispered. Harold tried to interrupt, waving the HOA handbook like it meant anything. But one by one, the residents began to realize the weight of what I was saying. They'd seen me endure fines, threats, and humiliation for that shed. And now the tables were turning. When I reached the conclusion, I placed one final sheet on the projector. A letter from the county recorder's office stamped in red ink, ownership confirmation granted. It was official. The HOA had accidentally destroyed a structure on private property while encroaching on land they didn't even own. All that control, all that arrogance, it evaporated in a single paragraph of legal confirmation. Harold's face drained of color. He stammered something about appeals and reassessments, but the other board members weren't backing him anymore. They'd seen enough. The treasurer rubbed her forehead. The secretary closed her binder quietly, and two members of the audience laughed under their breath. Then, in a rare moment of poetic timing, Attorney Raymond, the same man who'd helped me file my claim, appeared in the doorway. With him came a county deputy carrying official notice of encroachment. The deputy read it aloud for everyone to hear. The Homeowners Association of Maple Heights is ordered to cease maintenance activities or access on the disputed property until further notice. That was it. Years of micromanagement, fines, and fear, suspended in 10 words. The room erupted, half with shock, half with joy. Neighbors clapped, some openly cheering, while Harold sat motionless, staring at the floor. His control hadn't just diminished, it had vanished. For years, he'd ruled by reminding everyone what they could lose if they disobeyed. But now he was the one losing something tangible. The park, the pride of his entire HOA presidency, was gone from his jurisdiction, legally transferred to the very man he'd tried to punish. When the meeting adjourned, I didn't stay for the arguments or the whispers that followed. I walked back home under the faint glow of streetlights, breathing in the cold air that suddenly felt heavy with victory. It wasn't joy exactly, it was justice. The next morning, an HOA notice appeared in everyone's mailbox, though this time it wasn't a threat. It was a plea. We are temporarily suspending operations pending review of property claims. Behind the words, it was clear they were broken. Yet part of me knew Harold wasn't done. His pride was too thick, his ego too big to let this go quietly. If he couldn't win through rules, he'd try through chaos. And as the weeks ahead would prove, even victory can turn volatile when a man refuses to admit he's lost. Victory should have felt simple, but it rarely does. After the meeting, Maple Heights changed in quiet ways. The streets seemed friendlier, the gossip softer, and for the first time in years, there were no more warning notes or citations left on anyone's door. The neighborhood breathed for the first time without Harold's rules tightening around its throat. But peace was never something Harold understood. For a few weeks, he vanished from sight. His pale blue SUV sat motionless in his driveway, blinds permanently drawn, lawn overgrown. A strange irony for a man who once fined others for untidy edges. People assumed he was finished. They wanted to move on. Then, one afternoon, envelopes arrived in nearly every mailbox bearing his signature. He was back. The papers were bold, stamped with legal jargon meant to intimidate. Harold claimed my property title was fraudulent, that my family's easement had been forged from outdated or fabricated documentation. He accused me of harassment, slander, and intentional destruction of community assets. In short, he was suing me. It wasn't about money. It was about ego. The lawsuit was his last attempt to wring authority from the ashes of his defeat. He thought dragging me back into court would scare me the way his letters once scared others. He expected silence. But this time, he didn't realize how much he had already lost, because the community no longer stood behind him. Within hours, word spread through the neighborhood forum. Almost no one defended him. Instead, residents posted screenshots of his old intimidation emails, pictures of fines issued for non-existent violations, and stories of how he'd threatened them with foreclosure over unpaid dues he created himself. His allies started apologizing publicly. Board members resigned one by one. By the end of the week, he was the only name left on a board that no longer existed. Still, his case went to court. I didn't panic. I printed every document again, the certified ownership confirmation, the notarized deeds, the historic plats, and a witness statement from the county surveyor. My lawyer told me to stay calm. People like him, he said, always believe they can bend reality back to their version. On the morning of the hearing, Harold arrived looking gaunt and desperate. His once perfect presentation had cracks now. Creased suit, tired eyes, trembling hands clutching letters he'd written himself. He launched into his argument with all the fury of a man convinced he was destined to win. He painted me as manipulative, the court as complicit, and claimed the county clerks had conspired against him. But every claim fell flat under the weight of evidence. Then came the moment that ended it all. Under oath, the judge asked him one question. Mr. Burns, did you or did you not authorize the demolition of the plaintiff's shed without verified ownership of the land? The room went silent before Harold stammered an answer. Yes, but collapsed his entire defense. The judge ruled decisively, dismissing his claim, awarding me damages for the shed, and ordering him to pay court fees. In his own arrogance, he dug a deeper hole. The verdict humiliated him publicly. News of the ruling spread almost instantly, reigniting attention from the earlier story. Local outlets called it the final nail in the HOA's coffin. But payback didn't end in the courtroom. When the financial penalties came due, Harold defaulted. The HOA account, already frozen, couldn't cover the amount. That's when the legal clause came into play. Property owned by the HOA could be seized as restitution. That included their storage shed, administrative building, and the tiny lot adjacent to the park, the one that had been sitting unused for years. It was transferred to me. Everything had come full circle. Harold had demolished my grandfather's shed without permission, and now the law handed me one of his. When the paperwork closed, I walked past the overgrown property. The old metal shed sat dull under the winter sun, its paint flaking and roof sagging. For once, I didn't feel anger, just a tired kind of peace. I rebuilt what he had destroyed, only this time symbolically. I turned that storage plot into a small community garden. The same neighbors Harold once threatened now came together every weekend, planting, laughing, and sharing stories under the shade of the same trees he once used to measure violations. But Harold didn't last long after that. Reports circulated that he'd moved out overnight, selling his home quietly to avoid further embarrassment. No one missed him. The HOA, as it once stood, was permanently dissolved by a majority vote the following spring. That chapter of control in Maple Heights had ended, but one final moment still lay ahead. A moment that would turn this small-town feud into something much larger. Because when the news of my victory made its way beyond the county, what came next would shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. The victory spread far beyond our quiet neighborhood faster than anyone imagined. What began as one man's fight over a shed turned into a story people across the country couldn't stop talking about. The local newspaper ran the first story under the headline, "Homeowner wins land dispute against HOA after bulldozed shed scandal." By the next morning, regional news outlets picked it up. Within days, the footage from the courtroom and the historical maps I had used for evidence circulated on social media. People loved it. Not because of me, but because it was something bigger. It represented every unfair fine, every overreach, every frustrated sigh from homeowners dealing with the same kind of small-scale tyranny. My quiet act of defiance had become a rallying point. Suddenly, my name wasn't just tied to Maple Heights, it was tied to a movement. The emails started first, hundreds of them. Strangers thanking me for standing up to what they called suburban dictatorships. Others asked for copies of my filings, hoping to use them in their own cases. It became overwhelming, but I read every message. They weren't just stories, they were reminders that the fight was shared. Then came the requests for interviews. Local TV reporters knocked on my door, national talk shows called, and even a real estate law firm offered to feature my case in an academic review. First, I declined. I wasn't a politician or an activist. I was just someone who refused to be bullied. But one invitation changed that. It came from a public interest group called Citizens for Property Justice. They wanted me to speak at a community reform forum, to share how a century-old easement exposed the flaws in modern HOA enforcement. I almost laughed. I wasn't a public speaker, but something about their tone convinced me to go. Maybe part of me wanted closure. The event took place in a modest conference hall outside the city, packed wall to wall with residents from across the state. People cheered when my name was announced. Not for who I was, but for what the story represented. Proof that ordinary people could win when the truth was on their side. I told them everything. How it started with one letter. How the bulldozer became a spark. How the truth sat in forgotten archives waiting to be found. The silence while I spoke was different from any HOA meeting. It wasn't out of fear but respect. When I finished, the applause was thunderous. Reporters called it the Maple Heights moment. And what followed was unexpected. Lawmakers attending the forum began discussing amendments to state housing policy, suggesting new oversight regulations for homeowners associations, transparency clauses, clearer property rights, and punishment for misusing community authority. All sparked by one man's shed. I didn't take credit. I didn't want it. But when they told me those reforms would be informally named the Wilson Amendment, after my family's old property name, I realized something my grandfather probably knew all along. Sometimes things built small. A wooden shed, a quiet act, can outlast everything built in arrogance. Back home, Maple Heights looked different. Without Harold, the place felt lighter. The new community committee who replaced the HOA ran on mutual help rather than control. Neighbors planted the garden together, repaired fences without permission slips, and hosted yearly gatherings in the park that, by law and by right, now belonged to everyone. The garden on the old maintenance lot thrived too. What used to be a monument to pettiness had become a symbol of cooperation. Kids planted marigolds in spring. Retired residents tended herbs and tomatoes in summer. Every season, something new grew on the land Harold once swore was untouchable. And in the center of that garden stood something special. A small wooden shed, rebuilt plank by plank in the exact dimensions of my grandfather's original. Inside hung his old hammer, framed photographs, and the notarized deed proving the land's rightful ownership. Above the door, a carved plaque read, "Some things can't be bulldozed." Every visitor stopped to read it. The story spread again online, not as a scandal anymore, but as a reminder of what happens when arrogance meets persistence. People said I took their land, but in truth, I hadn't taken anything that wasn't already mine. I simply reminded them, and everyone like them, that authority means nothing without honesty. When I stand there now, under the sunlight spilling across the garden, I don't see victory. I see restoration, because this fight was never about property lines or fines. It was about dignity, about proving that even the smallest person, armed with patience and the truth, can force an empire of arrogance to crumble. And for all their rules, their handbooks, their meetings, there is one law no HOA can rewrite. The past remembers what's rightfully yours.